Section 5 of Imperialism and World Politics, Part 3 of 4, by Parker Thomas Moon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Alistair. Chapter 14c, The Battle of Concessions in the Far East, Part 3. Subsection, The Washington Conference. The reaction against Japanese imperialism became more pronounced after the peace conference. Chinese merchants caught the spirit of the new Chinese nationalism and boycotted Japanese goods. The United States government protested against the continued Japanese occupation of eastern Siberia, and in the Senate at Washington, as well as in the press, Japan's retention of Shantung was denounced, and anti-Japanese sentiment in the United States reached a dangerous pitch. In Canada and Australia, moreover, there was strong opposition to the renewal of the Anglo-Japanese alliance, partly because it might offend the United States. Japanese imperialism had gone too far and too fast. Even in Japan, there were liberals bold enough to oppose the aggressive policy of their government. But most serious of all was the fact that the United States was building super dreadnoughts more rapidly than Japan, with her small financial resources, could hope to do. Out of this situation grew the Washington Conference of 1921 to 1922. At that conference, the United States and Great Britain worked together with such effect that Japan found it expedient to purchase naval security by sacrificing, in part, her imperialism. Japan agreed to evacuate Siberia. She also agreed by a separate treaty with China to give up the leased territory of Jiaozhou Bay, to sell the German railway in Shantung to China, and to allow the exploitation of the Shantung coal mines by joint Sino-Japanese companies. To make this surrender easier, Great Britain offered to give up the leased port of Weihaiwei, and the French delegate promised to relinquish Zhangjiang Bay. Thus, 3 of the leased ports were to be returned to China, but Great Britain did not offer to restore Hong Kong, nor did Japan loosen her grip on Port Arthur. Nor had Weihaiwei and Zhangjiang been surrendered when this was written. At the Washington Conference, Japan also consented to an open-door treaty signed by 9 powers and embodying anti-imperialist principles advocated by the Chinese and by the United States. As defined by this treaty, the open door in China was to mean more than a nominal respect for China's independence and territorial unity, and more than equal treatment as regards tariff duties, railway charges, and harbour duties. It was to mean that the powers would not seek monopolistic economic rights in any part of China, or agreements designed to create spheres of influence. This was a blow at the vitals of imperialism. The conference also resolved that in future there must be no secret agreements with or concerning China. This struck at the chief method of the old imperialist diplomacy. Moreover, the conference formally voiced its hope that China would unify the various Chinese railways into a national railway system under Chinese control, employing such foreign financial and technical assistance as might be needed. This was a definite repudiation of the railway imperialism that had prevailed since the 1890s. The building of railways in China as separate enterprises under British or French or German or Russian or Belgian or Japanese control. Footnote: these principles should be studied in connection with the consortium. Confer Infra, page 370, 36 minutes and 52 seconds of this section. End footnote. Were the principles enunciated by the Washington Conference to be fully carried out, China would be emancipated from the most undesirable features of European and Japanese imperialism, and the imperialist policies that had prevailed since about 1895 would be suddenly reversed. Unfortunately, these were declarations of principles, not tangible and specific alterations of fact, and in world politics declarations of principles have not always been strictly observed in practice. How effective the principles would be in this case was a matter of dispute. Some critics believed that despite the principles, Japanese imperialism would in reality be unrestrained, because at the Washington Conference the United States and Great Britain promised not to fortify their island possessions in the Pacific, not including Hawaii, and without fortified naval bases it would be difficult for either to undertake naval action against Japan. "There is only one force which can now be brought to bear upon Japanese imperialism," writes Professor Buell in his book on the Washington Conference, and that force is world opinion. World opinion is the only force that can check Japanese imperialism without substituting for it some other imperialism. Subsection: The stakes of imperialism. It is time to take stock of imperialism in the Far East. The stakes for which imperialists have contended in Eastern Asia are so enormous as to beggar description. China, let it be remembered, is, with her dependencies, a third larger than the United States in area, and 3 times as populous. Add Great Britain without her colonies, and France and Germany, and Italy and Japan together, and you would have a nation a 5th as large as China, and only 3/4 as strong in manpower. Then remember that in China there are beds of coal and ores of iron, besides tin and other minerals, and an unknown quantity of oil that will provide the vital raw materials for an incalculable industrial development. As a nation, and as an industrial power, China may one day be so gigantic that one will wonder how the so-called great powers of the early 20th century could have ever laid the shackles of their imperialism upon her. And besides China, there is eastern Siberia, vast in extent, an undeveloped country. European and Japanese imperialists, however, have looked primarily to immediate profits rather than to ultimate results. Their concern has been with their own generation. The stakes in which they have been interested are the Chinese railways and mines, and commerce, and loans, and naturally the strategic and territorial accompaniments of such economic affairs. In the half-century since 1876, about 8,000 miles of railway have been built in China. This in itself meant the investment of hundreds of millions of dollars of foreign capital. The mines of coal, iron, copper, tin, and antimony have been developing rapidly. They represent a more or less speculative interest which is bound to increase in importance. Chinese commerce has developed from almost nil 80 years ago to $1,800 million a year, the average of 1919 through 1924. Japan obtained 24%, the United States 17%, Great Britain 9%, and the Anglo-Chinese port of Hong Kong 25% of this trade. Chinese trade means over $200 million a year to British merchants, chiefly British importers of tea and exporters of cotton. It means as much to Japanese importers of beans and bean cake, silk and raw cotton, and Japanese exporters of cotton and metal goods. It means many millions to American cigarette manufacturers, to Standard Oil, to silk dealers. Incidentally, the Chinese trade gives employment to thousands of British, Japanese, American, and other ships. Finally, foreign bankers have lent China $1 billion, usually at a relatively high rate of return, as the investment is somewhat risky. And in addition to these public loans, there must have been hundreds of millions invested in private commercial and industrial ventures, and in banking institutions in China. The stakes are large. Among European powers, Great Britain obtained the largest share of these economic stakes of diplomacy, obtained them not so much through superior diplomacy as through more highly developed finance and trade. British capital built 1/6 of China's railways. For years, British merchants almost monopolized the China trade, and although they have suffered from Japanese and American competition, still Great Britain and Hong Kong have about 1/3 of it. French capitalists obtained the copper and tin mines in Yunnan, and, through Russian and Belgian syndicates, a considerable share of railway profits, but little commerce. Germany's modest share, in Shantung, was lost by the war. Italy had almost nothing. Bolshevist Russia at first seemed disposed to surrender what Tsarist Russia had won in the Far East. The Russian communists denounced and renounced imperialism. Moreover, for a time Allied troops occupied Manchuria and eastern Siberia, and the Japanese occupied northern Sakhalin. But when the Allies evacuated Manchuria and Siberia, the Bolshevists engaged in a most interesting Far Eastern policy. To begin with, they reclaimed the former Russian territories by reintegrating eastern Siberia with Soviet Russia, and by persuading Japan, at the price of oil concessions, to relinquish northern Sakhalin. They also made a treaty with China, May 31st, 1924, whereby they renounced special rights and privileges, notably extraterritoriality in China, and their share of the Boxer indemnity. Yet they asserted ownership of the Chinese Eastern Railway. Generously, they agreed to permit China to purchase it, if China could raise the funds. But in the meantime, a Russian was to be manager. Communism claimed to be heir to imperialistic capitalism. The claim was disputed, however, by the Russo-Asiatic Bank, which had financed the railway company, and was now controlled by French financiers and non-communist Russians. France and the United States also entered protests. Difficulties arose, too, with the Chinese warlord of Manchuria, Zhang Zuolin, who desired to use the railway for troop movements, without necessarily paying fares for his soldiers very promptly. In another quarter, Soviet Russia was even more aggressive than the Tsars had been. The old Russian government had made Mongolia a sphere of interest. Soviet Russia made it a Soviet state, dominated by Russia. Despite these variations, the main trend of Russian-Soviet policy in the Far East was propaganda against Anglo-American imperialism and capitalism. If such propaganda won converts in China, and if some Chinese politicians found Russian support useful, it was not surprising, nor necessarily ominous. Its chief immediate effect was to add additional complications to Chinese internal politics, while accentuating the Chinese reaction against foreign financial control. Subsection: Japanese imperialism. That Japanese businessmen and statesmen wished to share in the spoils was not at all surprising. That they should have gained so large a share was due to the accident of geographic proximity, and to the intense zeal which Japanese militarists and millionaires plunged into the melee. By appropriating the Russian and German spheres of interest, and by utilizing the opportunity afforded by the Great War, Japan obtained first place in the Far East, from a political point of view. While in the economic exploitation of China, Japan is rapidly overtaking Great Britain, and will doubtless soon surpass her. As I write these words, however, I realize that they misrepresent the situation. Political influence in China is a shifting, evanescent thing, and to view the Japanese commerce with China and Japanese investment in China as Japan's share, obtained by imperialism, is misleading, for without imperialism, Japanese merchants would still trade with China, and Japanese capitalists would invest in China. Specifically, Japanese imperialism has meant the annexation of Formosa and Korea, and the virtual annexation, by a 99-year lease, of a few hundred square miles around Port Arthur and Dalny, in southern Manchuria, and the establishment of spheres of interest in Manchuria, eastern Mongolia, Shantung, and Fujian. Formosa, Taiwan, an island about twice as large as the state of New Jersey, has proved a burden rather than a benefit to Japan since it was annexed in 1895. Japan has built many good roads, constructed 369 miles of railway, established telegraph, telephone, and postal services, opened Japanese schools, encouraged mining and fishing and agriculture at a cost, and with small return. The taxes raised in Formosa have been insufficient to pay the cost of administration. Even in recent years, Japan has regularly paid a deficit from 5 to 9 million yen. Formosa produces most of the world's camphor under a Japanese government monopoly, and exports a few $1 million worth of tea, sugar, and coal to Japan. But the game is hardly worth the candle. Nor has the island proved an outlet for Japanese surplus population. After 30 years of Japanese rule, there are only 167,000 Japanese on the island. Most of the population consists of Chinese, who frequently rebel and bitterly resent Japanese rule. In the mountains are about 100,000 Aborigines, most of whom have been subdued and compelled to become more or less civilized, even though many a Japanese soldier gave his life in the process. Korea, Choson, was a more promising colony. After the Japanese annexation, Korea's exports, chiefly rice, beans and cattle products, multiplied tenfold in 10 years. The imports, chiefly cotton, machinery, coal from Japan, and kerosene from the United States, were multiplied by 7, and Japan enjoyed the bulk of the growing trade. The development of Korea's abundant coal and iron resources, restricted to Japanese corporations after 1916, was retarded by the lack of transportation facilities, yet the yield of minerals rose from 6 million to 25 million yen in 10 years. Moreover, the abundance of cheap Korean labour enabled Japanese capitalists to establish numerous and profitable factories. Materially, Korea was benefited. Handsome government buildings, neat railway stations, up-to-date school buildings, 1,500 busy factories gave the country a progressive appearance and impressed foreign visitors with the efficiency of Japanese administration. The Japanese official reports on the administration of Korea tell of reforms and progress. Koreans, on the other hand, complain that Korea became a paradise for Japanese loan sharks and speculators, that intellectual liberty was strangled, that Korean farmers were systematically driven off their land to take refuge in Manchuria. A report by the Presbyterian Board of Foreign Missions stated that nearly 500,000 Koreans had fled across the border. If this is true, the exodus of Koreans was greater than the influx of Japanese immigrants, for only 337,000 Japanese were counted in 1924. The Japanese, it may be added, preferred to live in the towns as tradesmen rather than engage in farming. It is easy to see why the Koreans should feel that they were being reduced to the position of hewers of wood and drawers of water. And it was almost inevitable that sentiments of nationalism and therefore of rebelliousness should spread among a population of 18 million Koreans governed by alien officials. The Korean nationalist agitation flared up at the close of the Great War, when nations everywhere were demanding self-determination. But by ruthless repression of the insurgents and imprisonment of suspects, Japan suppressed the movement for the time being. Korea was a rich colony, but would Japan be able to hold it permanently in the face of Korean nationalism? As I write, I have before me a beautifully illustrated little book entitled Manchuria, Land of Opportunities. It shows handsome hotels and banks in the port of Dairen, Dalny. It pictures the famous South Manchuria Railway Express, the only train in the Orient with all-American equipment. There is a photograph of the great coke ovens at the Anshan Steelworks in South Manchuria, and a snapshot of an American steam shovel at work in the Fushuan collieries. And another picture shows an endless vista of bags of soya beans piled high in the railway yard at Changchun, awaiting shipment to Japan. That perhaps is the best summary of what Japan has done in Manchuria. The book is distributed free of charge by the South Manchurian Railway Company, a concern partly owned by the Japanese government. With property valued at $700 million and share capital of $220 million, this company has made net profits rising from $1 million in 1907 to 1908 to $31 in 1921 to 1922. Its dividends have risen to 10%. The Japanese sphere of interest in Manchuria is a matter of 10% dividends. It is not a matter of colonization. Manchuria is inhabited by about 15 or 20 million Chinese, mostly hard-working farmers. The exact number is uncertain. Japanese imperialism rests its case, as popularly presented, on 4 arguments. First, that Japan has a surplus population, for which outlets must be found. Japan's population is relatively dense, It is true, and appallingly poor on the whole. But as must now be clear, the territories Japan has annexed have not been outlets for population. Japanese prefer to remain in Japan if they cannot gain admission to countries like the United States, Canada, and Australia, where wages are high and profits easy. Surplus population is not a tenable argument for Japanese imperialism. Second, that Japan needs raw materials and food, especially rice and iron and coal. This indeed is true. It is true in one form or another of every industrial nation. The chief question is whether a nation should buy its raw materials or annex them. Third, that Japan has a civilizing mission in Asia, that Japanese imperialism means the economic development of Korea or Manchuria or Formosa, and efficient administration and sanitation and fine public buildings and railways. This is also true, though the whole truth would include a statement that the mines and railways and fine buildings are owned by Japanese capital, and the economic progress inspired by motives of profit for Japanese capital. Fourth, that Japan has the right, in self-protection, to declare a Monroe Doctrine for Asia, like the American Monroe Doctrine for the Western Hemisphere. This was one of the points for which Viscount Ishii tried in vain to obtain Secretary Lansing's approval in 1917. It is one of the most popular Japanese imperialist arguments. It is true enough in a way, but it seems to ignore the fact that whereas the United States contains more than half the population of the Western Hemisphere, Japan contains about 6 or 7% of the population of Asia. The real causes for Japanese imperialism are chiefly the profit motive on the part of certain Japanese capitalists, the aggressiveness of the militarist class, and the supporting patriotism of the common people. Since the Revolution of 1867, a small group of military leaders, drawn largely from the old noble clans of Satsuma and Choshu, have enjoyed such influence in the Japanese government that, where military or naval interests have been concerned, the constitution and the parliament have been a sham. The militarists, like militarists the world over, have been intent on conquest, and have looked upon the Far Eastern situation almost exclusively from the point of view of warlike strategy. Opposed to them, there has developed a strong liberal movement among the bourgeoisie, and a demand for democracy on the part of the masses. In course of time, there can be little doubt the liberals will triumph. The Japanese government will be made genuinely responsible to the people, and the militarists will be forced into the background. Such a change would not necessarily mean a total abandonment of imperialism. England and France reconcile imperialism with democracy easily enough. But it would probably mean the substitution of the more peaceful and subtle methods of economic imperialism, of investment, and trade for the aggressive military imperialism of the old regime. Subsection: China's Risorgimento. Otherwise, a clash must come with China, perhaps with the United States, perhaps also with the British Empire. China, as we have repeatedly suggested, will not permanently remain an inert Gulliver to be bound by Lilliputians. The present impotence of the nation, which Napoleon described as a sleeping giant, is not due, as one often hears, to an inherent inability to fight. There are more soldiers under arms in China today than in Japan, and they are continually fighting. Nor is it due to a lack of capacity for organization. The strength of Chinese commercial tongs and boycotts is a marvel of organization. It is due, in the first place, to the weakness of Chinese central government, and that is due primarily to the vastness of the country, and secondarily to historical traditions, and thirdly to the diversity of vernacular languages. The factor of area, however, is very rapidly being overcome by railway and telegraph and postal service. These are unifying China. The lack of able leaders and of popular interest in the national government is being overcome by the rising generation of enthusiastic Chinese students, educated either in Chinese colleges or abroad, and ardently interested in methods of government, as well as in the welfare of their country. The present generation of self-seeking tuchuns, apparently devoid of patriotism, is likely to be followed by a generation of only too zealous patriots, and public schools are beginning to make some slight progress in the matter of linguistic unity. China's impotence is also due to an economic backwardness that cannot long continue. Because China needed foreign capital to build railways, open mines and create factories, and above all, because the Chinese tax system was antiquated, China was a borrowing nation, at the mercy of creditors. The Chinese government could not raise adequate revenues from customs duties, because from 1842 on, the tariff was held down to a nominal 5%, actually much less, by treaties which European powers had forced on Peking. In 1922, at the Washington Conference, China was given conditional permission to raise the tariff to an actual rate of 5%, with provision for a further increase to 10% when the antiquated Chinese tax known as the Li Jin should be abolished. In accordance with the Washington Agreement, the 5% was made effective at once, and in 1925 a tariff conference was held to discuss the proposed increase of the percentage. The Chinese demanded tariff autonomy and desired to impose different rates on raw materials, manufactures and luxuries, as so many modern nations do. The foreign powers agreed to grant China tariff autonomy in 1929, but insisted on a low maximum rate, much lower than their own tariff rates in the interim. The internal taxes are obsolete, they are dishonestly collected, and some of them are pledged to foreign bankers. The revenue of the Chinese government is less than that of Japan, though China has 6 or 7 times as many taxpayers, a considerably larger foreign trade, and infinitely greater economic resources. China's foreign debt of about 2/3 of $1 billion, exclusive of railway loans, which are taken care of by railway receipts, is less than Japan's foreign debt, and her internal debt is a mere trifle compared with that of Japan, or the United States, or any other great power. Yet China staggers under the burden. However, the rapid development of railways, mines, factories and agriculture warrants the prediction that such a debt will be easily borne in the future. Since the importation of machinery was first permitted in China in 1895, there have sprung up 19,000 factories employing power-driven machinery, 1923, and the value of Chinese factory products exported annually has increased to about $100 million in 1922. Hand in hand with this industrial development goes the development of capitalism, the increase of private wealth, the expansion of Chinese banks. All this means clearly that China is becoming a great industrial power, which in turn means that China will be a great power. And against such a great power, a comparatively small nation like Japan cannot safely continue the imperialist game. Subsection: Dollar Diplomacy. There is also the United States. President Wilson said in 1913 that the American interests in the Far East are those of the open door, a door of friendship and mutual advantage. On the whole, this is true, if we exclude the Philippines for the moment. It is to the interest of American exporters and importers, manufacturers and producers to have the right of trading on equal terms with foreign competitors in the Far East. American exports to China were $24,628,000 in 1913-14, and $124,436,000 10 years later. It is in the interest of a considerable number of American capitalists to participate in lending money to China, or in financing Chinese railways. There is also a strong missionary interest in China, and a powerful popular sympathy with China's struggle for freedom. In pursuance of such interests, the United States government, until the Great War, pursued with remarkable continuity its policy of advocating the open door, of protesting against, but not seriously attempting to prevent, the leasing of ports and demarcation of spheres of interest. This American policy conflicted, before the Great War, with British, Russian, French, as well as Japanese imperialism. But the conflict with Japanese interests was becoming more acute before the war, and since the war has assumed first-rate importance. The crux of the matter has been the question of American participation in Chinese railway concessions and loans. In the first Battle of Concessions in 1898, a valuable prize in the form of a concession for a railway from Hankow on the Yangtze to Canton in South China had been won by the China Development Company, a New Jersey corporation representing Standard Oil, the American Sugar Refining Company, and other interests. The China Development Company also made an agreement in 1899 with British interests regarding their railway projects. Americans, however, did not push the enterprise, and consequently, in 1905, the concession was cancelled and the company compensated by a payment of $6,750,000. American interests were given a new direction by Edward H. Harriman, the American railway magnate, who dreamed of establishing a round-the-world railway and who hoped to obtain the South Manchurian Railway as one link in the globe-circling system. As Japan had just conquered this line from Russia by the War of 1904-5, Harriman made a tentative agreement in September 1905 with Prince Ito and Marquis Katsura for joint American-Japanese ownership and control. The Japanese government, however, under the influence of business and military interests, dropped this plan, and likewise refused its consent to Harriman's scheme of purchasing from the Russians the Chinese Eastern Railway. Not to be defeated so easily as this, Harriman next considered the possibility of building a parallel line that would connect Jinzhou, on the Gulf of Liaotung and connected with Peking by rail, with Aigun on the North Manchurian frontier, and thus with the Trans-Siberian. Willard Straight, at first as Consul General and later as representative of Harriman, and his financial associates, negotiated an agreement October 2, 1909, according to which this line was to be constructed by a British engineering firm, financed by a group of American banks, J.P. Morgan & Co., Kuhn, Loeb & Co., First National Bank, and the National City Bank, and operated by an Anglo-American Chinese company. Secretary Knox seized upon this opportunity to suggest to Great Britain his famous neutralization plan. In a memorandum, November 6, 1909, he wrote,
"Perhaps the most effective way to preserve the undisturbed enjoyment by China of all political rights in Manchuria, and to promote the development of those provinces under a practical application of the policy of the open door and equal commercial opportunity, would bring the Manchurian highways and railroad under an economic and scientific and impartial administration, by some plan vesting in China the ownership of the railroads through funds furnished for that purpose by the interested powers willing to participate."
He suggested that Japan and Russia might welcome this opportunity to shift part of their responsibilities and expenses in Manchuria. Of course, the project should be made attractive to bankers by liberal terms, and the lending powers should supervise the railroad system for a period of time and enjoy
the usual preferences for their nationals and materials.
Knox expressed hope that Russia and Japan would welcome the plan to share with England and America and Germany their spheres of influence in Manchuria, perhaps more inspired by suavity than naivete, was rebuffed without either. Russia pointed out that the Chinese Eastern Railway, the bonds of which were guaranteed by the Russian government, represented Russian economic and strategic interests in Manchuria, which might be gravely injured by the projected Jinzhou-Aigun line. Moreover, by a secret agreement of June 1, 1899, China had promised Russia an option on any railways built in the future from Peking to the north or northeast toward the Russian border, unless built with Chinese capital. Japan simultaneously, on January 21, 1910, expressed her objections to the project and reminded the American government that, "in the regions affected by the Japanese railways in Manchuria, there have grown numerous Japanese industrial and commercial undertakings, which owed their inception, as they owe their continual existence, to the fact that the imperial government possessing the railways in question are able to extend to those enterprises and to the persons engaged in them due protection and defense against attack and pillage by lawless bands that still infest the country." Great Britain supported her ally Japan in this stand, as France supported her ally Russia. Furthermore, in order to offer united resistance to American encroachment on their interests, Japan and Russia signed a convention, July 4, 1910, pledging themselves to cooperate in developing their respective railway lines in Manchuria, abstaining from competition with those lines, maintaining the status quo in Manchuria, and opposing interference with the status quo. That status quo, of course, was a Japanese monopoly or sphere of interest in South Manchuria, and a Russian monopoly in North Manchuria. Defeated in Manchuria, the American bankers' syndicate was successful in the battle simultaneously waged for a share in the Hukuang Railway loan, which was to cover the completion of the old Hankow Canton Railway project, besides the construction of important branch lines. Learning that the Chinese government intended to award this big contract to a syndicate of German, French, and British bankers, the American syndicate demanded the right to participate. Secretary Knox acted as their official champion, and when Knox appeared ineffective, President Taft himself, disregarding diplomatic practice, sent a personal telegram on July 15, 1909, to Prince Chun, Regent of China, in which he said,
"I have an intense personal interest in making the use of American capital in the development of China an instrument for the promotion of the welfare of China, and an increase in her material prosperity, without entanglements or creating embarrassments affecting the growth of her independent political power and the preservation of her territorial integrity."
The weight of Taft's intervention helped tip the scales in favor of the American group. The Deutsche Asiatische Bank, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, and the Banque de l'Indochine took into partnership the Morgan Kun Loeb First National City Syndicate and signed an agreement on May 20, 1911, to lend China $30 million for the Hukuang Railway system. The same four-power group of banking syndicates also drew up an agreement with China, April 15, 1911, to lend the latter $50 million to be used in standardizing the Chinese currency and in promoting industrial enterprises in Manchuria, the bonds being secured by a surtax on salt and by certain taxes in Manchuria. The Knox policy at last appeared to be on the way to success. The four-power group had invaded Manchuria. Subsection: the Consortium. This policy of internationalized financial imperialism was strengthened after the Chinese Revolution of 1911, when Yuan Shikai sought a reorganization loan of $125 million. Russia, the Russo-Asiatic Bank, and Japan, the Yokohama Specie Bank, were now admitted to the combination. An agreement signed on June 12, 1912, by the British, French, German, American, Russian, and Japanese bankers, representing syndicates of powerful financial houses in their respective countries, established what has been known as the Six-Power Consortium of 1912. The six national groups were henceforth to share equally in the reorganization loan and in future loans. Just when the consortium seemed well established, President Wilson was inaugurated, and on March 18, 1913, he announced that he did not approve American participation because the conditions of the reorganization loan seemed to touch very nearly the administrative independence of China itself. Wilson felt that the international financial monopoly might lead to objectionable and perhaps forcible interference with Chinese independence. Thus, the Americans dropped out. Then came the war, which ruled out Germany, and the Bolshevist Revolution, which eliminated Russia. During the war period, there was a return to the older methods of financial rivalry in China. Japan, as we have seen, presented her 21 demands, made several new loans independently, and sought to strengthen her hold on South Manchuria, Eastern Mongolia, Shantung, Fujian. Americans, however, were not wholly idle. In 1916, the American International Corporation secured the contract for a loan of $3 million to improve the Grand Canal. At the same time, Siemens & Carey, a Chicago firm, got a concession to build 1,500 miles of railroads in various parts of China. In June 1918, however, the State Department at Washington held a conference of representatives of the 36 American banks interested in Chinese finance to discuss a revival of the consortium policy. President Wilson apparently saw the problem from a new angle. International financial cooperation now appeared the best way to prevent China from becoming, through Japanese loans, a Japanese protectorate. A new consortium was to be formed of American, British, French, and Japanese banks to share alike. The Japanese expressed their willingness if Manchuria and Mongolia, Japanese spheres of influence, were excluded from the consortium's operations. Obviously, Japan preferred to play a lone hand there. The United States government objected to any such exclusion. For several weeks the controversy continued. until the United States agreed that the consortium would not attempt to internationalize Japanese vested interests, such as the South Manchurian Railway, and Japan came into the consortium. The new four-power consortium agreement was signed in 1920. Through all these torturous financial maneuvers, there ran the conflict between the imperialist doctrine of spheres of influence, of which Japan had become the chief protagonist as regards Chinese affairs, and the American doctrine of equal opportunity. The Open Door Treaty of the Washington Conference of 1922 was a victory in principle for the American position, though in practice Japan was allowed to retain her vested interests. More and more clearly it appeared that the American tendency was to erase the partition lines which imperialists had drawn in China, and demand for ambitious American bankers their share in Chinese finance. Against American finance, Japan had little prospect of waging a successful struggle. The attempt of the Japanese to float in the New York market securities of the South Manchuria Railway and of the Oriental Development Company was a significant indication that Japanese captains of finance saw a way out of the difficulty: cooperation. End of section 5.